The call came in at 4:51 on a Friday afternoon, and Margaret Voss would later remember exactly where she was standing when she answered it. She was at the floor-to-ceiling window of her office on the 23rd floor, looking down at the parking structure below, watching the first wave of weekend traffic begin to move. The city of Raleigh spread out behind it in the particular bronze light of late October, and she had been holding a glass of water and thinking about nothing more complicated than the dinner reservation she had made for 8 o'clock. Then her phone rang, and it was her head of operations, a precise and unflappable man named Carter Doyle, and the particular quality of his voice in the first 3 seconds told her that the dinner reservation was going to be a problem. He said the words slowly and in the correct order, which was how Carter always delivered information he did not want to deliver. The phrase was, "The Meridian shipment has stopped moving." Margaret did not ask him to repeat it. She set the water glass down on the windowsill and said, "Tell me where." The Meridian contract was the largest active agreement in the Voss-Hartley portfolio. It was a supply arrangement with a national hospital network that had been signed 17 months earlier after 2 years of negotiation, and it governed the distribution of medical-grade equipment pumps to 11 regional fulfillment centers across 6 states. The arrangement was not simply large in dollar terms, though the dollar terms were significant. It was large in the sense that mattered more, which was that if it failed, the downstream consequences would affect hospital procurement cycles, surgical equipment timelines, and the kind of people who did not appear in quarterly earnings summaries. Margaret had been the one to sign that contract. She had stood in a room full of attorneys and shaken hands with the Meridian procurement director, and felt the weight of the thing settle onto her shoulders with the specific gravity of something she understood was real. She understood that now in a different register. Carter told her what he knew, which was still incomplete at that hour. 3 of the 11 fulfillment centers had stopped receiving scheduled deliveries as of noon that day. The routing system had generated a cascade of rerouting flags that the automated exception protocol had tried to resolve and failed. The origin point of the failure appeared to be a sequence break in the distribution logic governing the third-tier relay nodes, the middle layer of the routing architecture that sorted and redirected shipments based on dynamic priority weighting. No one on the current operations team could explain what had broken, or why the system had failed to recover, because no one on the current operations team had built that layer. It had been built by someone who no longer worked at Voss-Hartley. Carter said that name carefully. He said, Garrett Howell. Margaret was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "Find him." She said it without thinking about the last time she had seen Garrett Howell, which had been in a conference room on the 9th floor 11 months earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, when she had sat across from him and told him in the language of executive decisions that his role was being eliminated as part of the company's restructuring initiative. She had said it clearly and without cruelty, and believed at the time that she was making the right call. She had been given a recommendation by her COO, a man named Philip Ashby, that the distribution architecture function could be absorbed into the broader operations team, and that the dedicated systems design role that Garrett held was redundant given the company's new operational direction. Philip had given her a cost analysis. He had given her an efficiency projection. He had not given her a technical assessment of what Garrett had actually built or what would happen to it in his absence, and she had not asked for one because it had not occurred to her that she needed to. She understood now that she had needed to. Carter called back 41 minutes later and said he could not find Garrett through any of the former employee contact channels. The email on record had been deactivated. The phone number rang to a generic voicemail with no name. Carter had tried the LinkedIn profile and found it had not been updated in 8 months. He had called 2 people in the company who had worked closely with Garrett, and neither of them had a current number. What? Margaret stood in the empty conference room on the 9th floor, the same room where she had conducted the termination meeting, and looked at the table and thought about the particular way Garrett had sat in that meeting. He had not argued. He had not asked her to reconsider. He had listened to everything she said with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who was storing information rather than reacting to it. He had asked one question at the end. He had asked whether the routing documentation he had maintained would be transferred to a new system owner or archived. She had told him it would be handled by the transition team. He had nodded once and thanked her and picked up his bag and left. She had not followed up on the documentation. Philip Ashby had assured her the transition was clean. The call she made at 6:22 that evening was to Philip directly. She asked him about the routing documentation for the third-tier distribution layer. There was a pause on the line that was not a technical pause. Philip said the documentation had been archived during the transition. She asked him where. He said he would check. She said she needed to know in the next 30 minutes. Philip did not call back in 30 minutes. He called back in 53 minutes and told her that the archive location had apparently not been finalized before Garrett's departure date, and that the documentation transfer had been noted as pending in the transition checklist and had not been completed. Margaret asked him how that was possible. Philip said that the transition period had been compressed and that certain items had been deprioritized. She asked him whether he understood what was currently happening to the Meridian shipments. He said he was aware of the situation. She said she would call him in the morning and ended the call. It was Carter Doyle who found the thread. He had gone back through the company's vendor and contractor database and cross-referenced former employee records with any active business registrations in the state, and he had found a listing for Howell Systems Consulting, registered 7 months after Garrett's departure, with a service address that was listed simply as a residual Losey de Chapersley in a neighborhood called Wood, on the south side of the city. The business had no website. It had a phone number. Margaret called it at 7:19 in the evening, standing at her kitchen counter with her coat still on, her dinner reservation long forgotten. The phone rang 3 times. A man answered and said, "This is Garrett." His voice was exactly as she remembered it. Quiet and even, with the particular calibration of someone who had learned to make themselves unobtrusive in rooms that did not value what they carried. She said her name. There was a pause that she could not read, because she did not know him well enough to read his silences, and that absence of knowledge landed in her chest with unexpected weight. He said, "Ms. Voss." She told him what had happened to the Meridian routing system. She told him specifically and without softening, because she understood that he would know within 30 seconds whether she was giving him the full picture or a managed version of it, and she was not going to insult him with the managed version. She told him about the cascade failure, the 3 fulfillment centers, and the fact that no one on her current team could identify the breakpoint. She told him that she was calling because she needed his help. There was a silence after she finished that lasted long enough for her to notice the sound of something in the background of his call. It was quiet and rhythmic. It took her a moment to identify it. Someone was reading aloud in a small voice, slowly, and with great concentration, the kind of concentrated reading that belongs to a child who is still learning the shapes of words. She recognized it because her own daughter had once made that exact sound, in a kitchen not unlike the one she imagined he might be standing in now. Garrett said, "Can you give me 15 minutes?" She said yes. He called back in 12. He told her that he needed remote access to the routing system's diagnostic layer and a direct line to whoever was currently managing the exception queue at the primary distribution hub. She provided both within 20 minutes through Carter, who was still at the office. What happened in the next 3 hours and 7 minutes, Margaret did not witness directly. She received updates from Carter at intervals. She sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen and wrote nothing on it, because there was nothing she could usefully write. At 11:04 in the evening, Carter called and said the routing sense system had recovered. All 3 fulfillment centers had resumed receiving correctly sequenced shipments. The cascade flags had cleared. The Meridian delivery window was intact. Margaret asked what the problem had been. Carter said it would take him time to explain it technically. But the short version was that the third-tier priority waiting logic had contained a conditional sequence that was triggered only under a specific combination of high-volume routing days and a calendar-based override flag that occurred 4 times a year. The previous 3 occurrences had been handled automatically because Garrett had built a manual patch into the system during his tenure, a patch that routed around the trigger condition without resolving it, because the underlying architecture was too deeply embedded to restructure without a full system rebuild. When he left, the patch remained in place but was not documented separately from the main architecture, because it was part of the same file set that had not been transferred. The 4th trigger had fired at noon on Friday. Without the patch active and without anyone who knew it existed, the system had done exactly what an unpatched system does under those conditions. It had failed. Carter said one more thing. He said that when Garrett had accessed the diagnostic layer, he had found his own patch still sitting in the queue, inactive since the transition, and had reactivated it in under 4 minutes. Margaret sat with that for a moment. A man who had built something careful and specific, and had been let go without anyone asking what he knew, who had then built it again from memory, in the middle of a Friday evening, from a room where a child was reading aloud. She said thank you to Carter and ended the call and sat at the kitchen table until the house was completely quiet. She had not thought about Garrett Howell in 11 months. She thought about him now, with the specific discomfort of a person who has been correct about something in the wrong direction. Which is to say, she had been correct that Garrett was not the kind of person who announced himself, and she had been wrong to interpret that quietness as an absence of the significance rather than a different kind of presence entirely. She thought about the way Philip Ashby had framed the recommendation. He had used the word redundant. He had used the phrase operational streamlining. He had not used the words, "This person built the system that moves every Meridian shipment and no one else understands how it works," because Philip did not know that, and she had not asked the people who did. She put the legal pad away and went to bed, and did not sleep particularly well. What she did not know that night, because the information had not yet arrived on her desk, was the fuller shape of what Garrett Howell had been doing in the 11 months since she had ended his role. That information came through her executive assistant, a careful woman named Renata Flores, who had a habit of reading the business filings and trade registrations that crossed her desk with more attention than her job description technically required. Renata had been doing this for 9 years and had developed an intuition for the filings that looked routine but were not. The Howell Systems Consulting registration had been in her queue since the previous spring, flagged with a yellow sticky note that said only, "FYI, former employee." Renata had placed it in a holding folder because at the time it seemed like information without context. After the Friday crisis, she pulled it back out and began to look at it more carefully. What she found, working methodically over a Saturday morning, was a pattern that had not been visible from inside the company. Garrett Howell had spent the first 4 months after his departure doing exactly what she might have expected. He had taken small consulting engagements, the kind that paid the bills and did not require his full attention. He had kept a low profile. His business registration was minimal. His digital footprint was almost non-existent. And then, beginning in the 5th month, the pattern shifted. Renata found a series of procurement filings through the county records system. She found a lease agreement for a commercial space in a light industrial corridor 2 miles from the Cedarwood neighborhood where Garrett lived. She found a business license application for a category she had to look up, which was Precision Logistics Systems Design and Integration. She found a vendor registration with the State Procurement Office. She found a contract award notice published in a public tender summary 6 weeks earlier for a distribution systems integration project with a mid-sized regional hospital supply cooperative that had been searching for a partner capable of handling dynamic priority routing across multi-node fulfillment networks. Renata read that sentence twice. Then she looked up the hospital supply cooperative. Then she looked at the contract value. She put the documents in order, wrote Garrett Howell's name on the folder tab, in her unhurried, accurate hand, and placed it on Margaret's desk, Monday morning with no explanation attached, because she understood that Margaret would read it and that the documents themselves would do all the explaining that was necessary. Margaret read it in her office with the door closed. She read it slowly, starting with the consulting registration and working through the procurement filings in order. She read the contract award notice twice. She looked out the window for a moment. Then she opened her laptop and searched Garrett Howell, same Horaldame, in combination with the name of the hospital cooperative. The results that came back were brief and professional. A single paragraph in a regional logistics trade publication, published 3 weeks earlier, describing the cooperative's new distribution systems architecture as representing a significant advance in dynamic routing precision for healthcare supply chains. The article named the systems designer as Garrett Howell of Howell Systems Consulting and described him as a specialist in complex multi-node distribution logic with experience in large-scale supply chain architecture. It did not mention Voss Hartley. It did not mention the 11 years Garrett had spent building the systems that Voss Hartley's operations currently ran on. It did not mention his daughter, or the neighborhood he lived in, or the hours he had kept while building something new from the same disciplined foundation he had always worked from. It mentioned only the work, which was how Garrett apparently preferred it. Margaret sat with that folder for a long time. The meeting she requested was not a meeting she enjoyed planning. She asked Renata to find a contact channel for Garrett, and Renata, without comment, produced the same phone number Carter had located the previous Friday. Margaret called it on a Tuesday morning, standing at the window of her office with her coffee cooling in her hand. He answered on the second ring. She said she wanted to meet. She said there were 2 things on the agenda and she wanted to be transparent about both. The first was the routing system documentation, which she wanted to formalize properly, with proper compensation, so that the patch he had reactivated on Friday was no longer a single-point dependency living in one person's memory. The second was a conversation she had not been ready to have 11 months ago and was now. There was a pause. He said he was available Wednesday afternoon. She asked where would be convenient for him. He said the Cedarwood address, his office. She said she would be there at 2 o'clock. She drove herself. No assistant, no driver, no folder of talking points under her arm. She had made that choice deliberately because the nature of what she was going to do did not benefit from the apparatus of executive presentation. The building Garrett worked from was a converted warehouse unit at the end of a short industrial block. It was plain and low and clean, the kind of building that made no claims about what happened inside it. The sign beside the door was simple black letters on a white panel, Howell Systems Consulting, not a logo, not a tagline, just the name and the nature of the work. She sat in her car for a moment before going in. She had been thinking, for the past 4 days, about the particular sequence of decisions that had brought her to this parking lot. Not with the dramatic self-recrimination that she might have applied to a larger failure, but with the specific, unglamorous clarity of someone reviewing a process that had produced a bad output and tracing back to find which inputs had been wrong. That was how she had been trained to think. It was usually a useful way to think. The uncomfortable part was that the faulty inputs were easy to find, and they all ran through the same node, which was her. Philip had given her a recommendation. She had accepted it without adequate verification. She had not asked what Garrett had built. She had not asked what would be lost when he left. She had not treated the question of human knowledge as a systems risk, even though she would have immediately recognized that same self-and failure mode in a technical architecture. She had known, in a general way, that Garrett was good at his work. She had not known because she had not asked what that meant specifically. And the gap between those two things had expressed itself as a crisis on a Friday evening that was only a crisis and not a catastrophe, because the person she had dismissed 11 months ago had answered his phone. She got out of the car. Inside, the space was organized with the same precision she associated now with Garrett himself. A long workbench along the left wall held a single active monitor and a row of labeled hardware components. A whiteboard on the right wall was covered in routing logic diagrams, neat and branching, with small annotations in the margins. A standing desk near the back window held a laptop and a stack of bound documentation. On the corner of the workbench, next to the monitor, there was a drawing in crayon. It was a house with a large sun above it and two figures in front of it, one tall and one very small, both with their arms extended as if the small figure had just run toward the tall one and been caught. The crayon strokes were confident and slightly crooked. Across the bottom of the drawing, in large letters that were still learning how to keep to a line, someone had written, "For Daddy." Margaret looked at the drawing for a moment and then looked away with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood they were looking at something they had not earned the right to see for long. Garrett came through a side door with 2 paper cups of coffee, set one on the edge of the workbench near her, without asking whether she wanted it, and sat on a stool. He was wearing a dark Henley and work pants and the same kind of unhurried stillness she remembered from every interaction she had ever had with him, which had not been many and had not, she understood now, been handled well. She wrapped her hands around the paper cup and said what she had come to say. She told him that she had reviewed the routing documentation situation and that it was her responsibility, not Carter's and not Renata's, that the transition had been incomplete. She told him she understood now what the third-tier architecture represented and what had been required to build it. She told him she wanted to formalize a consulting arrangement that properly compensated him for documenting the system and for the engagement on Friday evening. She named a number. It was fair, and she had not discounted it. Then she stopped talking and let the other part of the conversation arrive. She said she wanted him to know that the recommendation she had received from Philip Ashby regarding his role had been presented to her as a straightforward operational decision, and that she had accepted it without doing the verification that the decision warranted. She said she was not telling him this as an excuse. She was telling him because he deserved to have it said directly and without the softening that would have made it easier for her to say. Garrett held the paper cup in both hands and looked at it for a moment. Then he said one thing. He said it quietly and without any of the heat that it might have carried, and that she would not have blamed him for. He said, "Do you remember what I asked you at the end of that meeting?" She did. She had been thinking about it for 4 days. He had asked about the routing documentation. She had told him it would be handled. She said yes. She said she remembered. He said he had asked because he knew the documentation was the load-bearing piece, and he had wanted her to have it. He said he had not been asking as a negotiation, and he had not been asking out of bitterness. He had been asking because he had spent 11 years building systems that were supposed to outlast any individual's tenure, and a good system was only as good as its documentation, and he had not wanted to leave something half-finished behind him. He said he had sent a follow-up email to the transition team 2 weeks after his last day with the documentation attached. Margaret felt the temperature of the room change in a way that had nothing to do with the November air outside. She asked him whether he had received a response. He said he had received an automated acknowledgement. She set her coffee cup down on the edge of the workbench and was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him, not as a question that required an answer, but as an honest statement made in his direction, whether he was willing to work with her on terms that reflected what she now understood about what he had built. He was quiet for a long moment. She did not try to fill it. He said he would review the consulting agreement terms and respond by the end of the week. He said that in principle he was willing, but that he had other clients now, and the arrangement would need to accommodate that. He said it without apology and without aggression, the way a person states a fact about themselves that they are no longer embarrassed by. She said she understood. She stood to go. At the door she paused, not because she had planned to, but because she was standing in front of the sign again. The simple, black letters on white, and she was reading it differently than she had read the name on the building she had sent him out of 11 months ago. She had thought then that certain kinds of work announced themselves, that the people who mattered were the ones visible in the architecture of the organization, in the org chart and the title and the corner office view. She had not been wrong exactly. She had been looking at the wrong kind of architecture. The people who mattered most in a complex system were often the ones whose absence you did not feel until the system stopped working, because they had built so carefully and so quietly that everything around them had learned to depend on them without ever learning their name. She had learned his name 11 months too late. She drove back through the city in the particular October light that turned everything the color of something ending, and she thought about a sequence of decisions she could not undo and a system that was still running because one person had answered his phone on a Friday evening while a child was reading aloud in the next room. The consulting agreement was returned to her office 4 days later, signed, with 2 amendments in the margins in Garrett's handwriting. Both amendments were reasonable. One was a clause specifying that all documentation produced under the agreement would remain jointly accessible. The other was a line that had been added at the bottom, below the signature block, in the same careful, undecorated hand. It said, "For the record, the follow-up email with full documentation was sent on December 3rd. The original message is still in the sent folder. I can forward it if useful." Margaret read that line and held very still for a moment. Then she picked up her pen, made a note to herself on the legal pad beside the agreement, and set it down again. The note said, "Call Philip Monday morning." What Philip Ashby said on that Monday morning call, when Margaret described the sent folder and the automated acknowledgement, and the documentation that had been sitting in an archive that no one had completed transferring, was that he had been unaware of the specific situation. He said it with the smooth, practiced register of a man who had learned to make uncertainty sound like reasonable. Margaret listened to all of it. Then she said she was going to need a full account of the transition process and which decisions within it had been Philip's. Philip submitted his resignation 11 days later. He submitted it by email, which was consistent with the way he had conducted most of his consequential communications at Voss Hartley, at one remove from the direct conversation. Margaret accepted it without response. She sat alone in the conference room on the 9th floor afterward for a few minutes. Not because she was processing emotion, or not only that, but because she had developed a habit in the preceding weeks of returning to the rooms where important things had happened and sitting in them quietly until she had an accurate picture of what those things had actually been. This was the room where she had told Garrett Howell his role was being eliminated. She had sat where she was sitting now. He had sat across from her. She had said the words that were required for that kind of meeting, and he had listened to them with the particular attention of someone who does not give their reactions to people who have not earned them. She had not known, sitting in that room, what he had built. She knew now. She had not known, sitting in that room, that the correct way to evaluate a person who had spent 11 years building load-bearing systems in the architecture of her company was not the same as evaluating an operational line item in a restructuring analysis. She knew that now too. The knowledge was not comfortable. It was not meant to be comfortable. It was the kind of knowledge that only arrives when the system fails, and you are honest enough to follow the failure back to its origin point, rather than stopping at the first plausible explanation. Margaret had built her career on not stopping at the first plausible explanation. That was the same quality that had let her sit in this room and be honest about what had happened in it. It was cold comfort, but it was honest comfort, which was the only kind she trusted. The documentation project with Garrett took 3 months. He came to the office twice, on his own schedule, and worked with the current operations team to produce a complete technical record of the distribution architecture. He was patient with the team in the specific way of someone who has spent a long time working alone and has not forgotten how to transfer knowledge to other people. He did not perform patience. He simply applied it, the way he applied everything, as a tool for producing a reliable result. Carter Doyle, who worked with him most closely during those 3 months, told Margaret during a routine check-in that Garrett had found 2 additional conditional trigger points in the routing logic, neither of which had yet caused a problem, both of which had been patched quietly before he completed the documentation. Carter said it with the tone of someone reporting something that he found both impressive and quietly sobering. Margaret said she understood. Carter said, "One more thing." He said that during the documentation work, Garrett had mentioned that he had tried, during his last 2 months at Voss Hartley, to schedule a technical review meeting with the operations leadership to walk through the routing architecture before his departure date. He had submitted the meeting request 3 times. It had not been scheduled. Margaret said she understood that too. She did not ask who had declined the meeting requests because she already had a reasonable idea. And she had already had the conversation that needed to be had about it. On the last day of the documentation project, Garrett stopped by her office before leaving the building. It was the first time he had come to the 23rd floor since his employment had ended. He knocked on the open door and she looked up from her desk, and for a moment the 11 months contracted to almost nothing, and she was simply looking at a person who had always been exactly what he was and whom she had not seen clearly enough soon enough. He said he wanted to leave her something. He set a small folder on her desk. Inside was the email from December 3rd, printed on a single sheet of paper, with the attachment listed at the bottom and the automated reply below it, dated 2 hours after the original send. It was not an accusation. It was what it was, a record of a thing that had happened. He said he thought she should have it for her own files. She said thank you and meant it without qualification. He said he hoped the system would hold. She said she believed it would now. He nodded once and picked up his bag and left. She held the printed email in both hands and looked at it for a long moment. A sheet of paper, a timestamp, a name in a sent folder, the specific weight of something that had been sent correctly and received incorrectly, and that had cost more than anyone had intended, and less than it might have. In the months that followed, the Meridian contract renewed without incident. The routing architecture documented by Garrett was trained into the current operations team, and Carter Doyle, who had a talent for systems thinking that Margaret had underestimated in a different way, extended the documentation into a formal operational protocol as a model for multi-node routing risk management. The trade publication that had covered the hospital cooperative contract ran a follow-up piece 6 months later that mentioned Howell Systems Consulting again, this time with a slightly longer paragraph, noting that the firm had expanded its client roster to include 2 Fortune 500 supply chain operations in the southeastern United States. No photograph accompanied the piece, no background narrative, only the work and the name. Margaret read the paragraph at her desk and then turned her chair to the window and looked out at the city for a while. There was a thing she had learned in the years she had been running organizations, and it was that the easiest mistakes to make were the ones that did not look like mistakes at the moment of making them. They looked like efficiency. They looked like bold decisions. They looked like the kind of clarity that teamly strong leaders were supposed to project. And then something broke, and you followed the break backward, and you found yourself sitting in a conference room looking at the record of a sent email that had never been answered, thinking about the quality of stillness in a man who had built something careful and been thanked for it in the wrong way. She had been correct about many things in her career. She intended to be more careful, going forward, about the specific things she chose not to ask. The city outside her window was the same bronze light it had been. On the afternoon she had received Carter's call, though it was a different October now, and a different place she was standing from. She had moved her desk closer to the window 6 weeks ago. No particular reason she could name, only that she had found herself wanting, lately, to see the whole of it, and not just the part the angle of her former position had shown her. She was looking at the same city. She was looking at it differently. That, she understood, was not nothing. It was not enough either, but it was a beginning, and a beginning in her experience was the only place a person could honestly start from. This is a work of fiction. All names, characters, companies, institutions, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional and are the product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or to actual events or organizations is purely coincidental. This story was created for entertainment and inspirational purposes only. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who has ever been underestimated. Every week, we tell the stories of the people the world walked past too quickly. They were worth stopping for.